Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leader of Tomorrow book tour event. And today we are starting with our first section, the ambassador. Um, we have with us Dr. Al Lewis, Melvin Brown, Robert Tremblay, and Bill Runny joining in us for talking about more in depth about the book that they have written. It was published last week, and we have got tremendous response in 1 week itself. So really excited to go deep into it because that time we could just do a quick 60-second round of discussions, but this time we're going to go deeper and we'll spend some real time with the four leaders who have written the playbook on the most public, most political dimension of school leadership. So drop your questions in the chat anytime and we'll get them in the later half. Perfect. Hi guys, thank you so much for joining in. How you doing?
Great, Avi. How are you?
I'm also good.
Great. Nice as well.
Good morning. Doing well.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy to be here.
Perfect. So I think the book response has been fantastic, and I am very ecstatic about how the book tour in the next 5 weeks are gonna be. So this session, the ambassador, is very interesting in my opinion because it is talking about school leadership from a perspective which is not talked about enough. We always talk about teacher issues, we talk about student parents, but board and navigating that is something which is always talked one to one. But you guys have decided to go out and share it with everyone. So I thank you so much and I welcome you guys to the book tour. So today we'll be talking about this topic for the next 45 minutes. And these four leaders have a combined experience of 80 plus. So I'm going to start this discussion with the foundational truth. And the theme of this round one is going to be, what did you have to unlearn? Right? So it's a very important part that unlearning is as much important as learning. So my first question to you, Al, if you can introduce yourself quickly and of course give a brief about your book. But my question to you specifically is, you wrote that as a leader, you walk into your superintendency, assuming that school board is one unit, it's a one audience. But how did that assumption break? And did it cost you anything?
Well, it cost me all my hair, first of all, so that's the real issue. But hey, folks, my name is Al Lewis. I'm the superintendent of Glassboro Public Schools in southern New Jersey, a beautifully diverse community situated about 30 minutes southeast of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So, yeah, Avi, as you said, I naively walked into my first superintendency. I was the youngest superintendent in the state at the time. I was 36 when I began my first superintendency. And I naively thought that the school board would just want the facts. All 9 members would want the same set of facts and be okay with that. And I learned very quickly that that assumption was totally wrong, that they're 9 individuals. They represent different elected spheres of the community. They have their own ambitions, their own pet projects, their own interests, their own set of values. And it really forced me to switch from being reactive to proactive when it came to how I prepared my board agenda, and then also just my conversations with board members individually, which I know we're going to talk about later as well. So, what did it really cost me aside from my hairline? It cost me some time, it cost me some energy, and like all superintendents, cost me a little bit of self-reflection of, what were my real ambitions here? What were my real goals for my board meetings? Which initiatives did I really value enough to push through? And then at what point was I going to say, I don't need a 9-0 vote on everything. Sometimes I'm okay with a 7-2 vote or an 8-1 vote if it's the right thing to do. But yeah, definitely really quickly learned that a school board is not a whole unit. It is 9 people or however many people you have elected to your school board. It takes a lot of wiggle room.
No, absolutely, it does for sure. Um, Melvin, are you there on the call?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Yeah, but I think we can't see you. Okay, but my question to you, Melvin, is in your book, you describe a moment when a purely operational decision triggered a political firestorm, that you didn't see it coming. So I would love to know about that particular story because that really was very exciting to me for a read and in a good way. So take us back to that moment. What did it teach you about the symbolism of your decision?
Yeah, I'll take us back roughly 6 years ago when all of us had to confront COVID and all of the nonsense that we needed to tackle during that time. What we basically were doing, we're making what we believe was going to be a straightforward operational decision about how to keep kids learning. I was at the time, oh, and by the way, I'm Melvin Brown. I'm currently superintendent resident at Define. I used to be the superintendent in Reynoldsburg City, Ohio, and in Montgomery, Alabama. So to give context. When I was in Reynoldsburg during COVID, like every district across the country, we had to pivot very quickly to an era of remote learning with devices, connectivity, schedules, meal distribution, all these things. And those were immediate problems in front of us that we needed to confront. So when we made decisions about reopening timelines and instructional models and safety protocols, we approached all that with some sort of logic, and those are logistical challenges that we needed to solve. How do we go about educating kids as effectively and safely as possible, given the current circumstances we needed to face? What I underestimated, at least initially, was that none of those decisions would be perceived as merely operational. There was so much more than that. We had the political ramifications from both state government, federal government. I can get on my soapbox about that. I won't do that at this time, but that complicated things and it made our conversations very difficult at the local level. I remember one particular decision around instructional delivery and how we would bring kids back to school in person. And from our vantage point as a team, it was grounded in data, local health metrics, staffing capacity, and our ability to implement mitigation strategies with fidelity. But so in our estimation, it was about feasibility. To our community, however, it wasn't just about feasibility. There was fear, trust, or lack of thereof, politics, and about those who felt their voices weren't heard and who didn't feel that they were part of the equation. What I thought was a decision about schedules and safety became, for many, a statement about values and beliefs, which is never where we wanted to be at that time. Some saw it as we were prioritizing health, others saw us as abandoning rigor and normalcy. Some believed we were moving too fast, others thought we were moving too slow, and that same decision was interpreted in many different ways, depending on where people's lived experiences and personal stakes. So the moment for me was pretty clear. There is no such early operational decision in leadership, especially in public education. That was something I had to learn and had to understand. Every decision carries some type of symbolic weight, and it signals what you prioritize. It communicates what you're listening to. It reveals what you believe, and when you don't explicitly say it, they know it based on your decisions. So if you don't actively shape that narrative, others will go about shaping that narrative for you. What I learned in that moment and what has stayed with me since is that leadership requires you to lead both the decision and the meaning of the decision. And you have to anticipate not just the logistical implications, but the emotional and symbolic ones. You have to over communicate, contextualize, and make values explicit. Because people will always interpret your actions through their own realities, and we have to understand that. So COVID didn't create that dynamic for us. It simply exposed it. It made us think differently about how we go about doing things. It forced me to evolve from thinking like a problem solver and more toward leading like a meaning maker. So I had to make everyone understand decisions needed to be made, but I needed to know how to do that from their context and to make sure I can have their thoughts, thought processes in mind in making those decisions. And not everybody's going to agree. And sometimes I had to accept that. That's just the way it is. Still there, Avi?
We got you, Melvin.
Okay, I want to make sure I wasn't frozen on my end.
The camera's not on, though.
It's not?
No.
That's weird. Let me try something.
Abby's back. Well, if you come back with TomoClub written on the top, we'll know it's working.
Yeah, I don't know where it went because I've done nothing on my end and it should still be there. That's weird.
Yeah, we would love to see you, but
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to go out and come back in.
perfect. But I think that's what a beautiful answer. That the entire context that we're setting up is the amount of unlearning that we have to do as a leader, in our journey. And my next question is to Robert. So, Robert, you were trained as a musician, before you became a superintendent, and you write about leadership as conducting an orchestra. So, when did you first realize that you're no longer playing an instrument, but you are holding the baton, right? So, tell us about that.
Yeah, thanks so much, and to my colleagues for being present today. My name is Bob Tremblay, Superintendent of Schools in Framingham, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. I don't know if I've lost everybody. I don't see anybody else on the screen.
I know you are on the spotlight. Go ahead.
I'm all set? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And so it's a pleasure to be with you all today. So, right, my path was an interesting one. I started, I didn't know at 10 years old when I was playing the trumpet that I would one day be a superintendent of schools. Nor did I ever think that I would apply the concepts as an orchestral conductor. There's books that have actually been written about this, so it's not anything that I've invented, but it's something I sort of have embraced, right? This idea of leading from the podium. And so for those who may not be familiar with music and how orchestral leaders conduct, for some, it can look like waving your arms on the podium. And while that there actually could be the case, you could just be waving your arms, but in really what's really happening is that the conductor is looking at a score, and that score is everybody's part all at once. And so you're reading, in some cases, maybe 30, 40 lines of music that actually is everybody's part of the orchestra. And what you come to realize is that the conductor, you may notice they're sort of waving this arm with their baton, and this arm is this very delicate cueing mechanism. And that is the metaphorical part of this work. And for me, it's the most important part, is sort of cueing the sections. And when I think of school leadership as a conductor, as superintendent as the conductor with the baton, is that I'm waiting for, I have section players, I have soloists, you have principal chairs of orchestras and so forth. And your job is to really be watching it all happen. I had a meeting just recently and knowing when to cue people into certain conversations. And so it's really making music, but it's also leading those cues. I had a meeting recently where it was a phone call, and I had people all around my table. And as they were talking, I found myself actually thinking about this whole strategy, conducting literally the meeting. So I was giving cues to people when to speak and to sort of set the tempo, if you will, of the conversation. And it was really kind of living the metaphor. But that's how I've become to view this as a leader, and I found that it's worked for me as a strategy. But sometimes you have the divas in the performance, the soloists that just want to shine out everybody else. And there's times to be a soloist, and there's times to be a section player. And then there's times when you're not practicing that you no longer play in the orchestra, right? So it's all of those difficult decisions. It's about giving cues. And at the end, it's about the leader having to know the score. And that's the application that I've used. So again, there's a lot of literature out there that I didn't invent on this, but something that I certainly in practice have applied. But Avinash, your question was very specific about when did I realize I wasn't playing anymore and I was holding the baton. And I'm not sure when the transition happened in my lifetime, but I will tell you, as a school leader, as a district now leader, having played in the section, having been an instrumentalist in a group where you're now conducting, is really important to understand and appreciating the work, right? So being a leader that has served in the trenches as an educator, as something in education, and one of the frustrations that goes back to my previous other colleagues' comments, especially with board relationships, you're often found that you're leading a district and leading the work, and you're being evaluated and supervised and in a public forum, largely by elected officials who's never actually held your day job. They've actually never worked a day, in many cases, in your role. And so how do you conduct that is probably the next question, right? So, but I appreciate the opportunity to comment a little bit on the metaphor, and hopefully it's helpful.
No, absolutely. I think that definitely excites me more to read about your chapter. And that's the idea, that people can get a sneak peek about what's going on. And let's see that will, they can get to know more story when they read the chapter. Um, Over to you, Bill. So there's a very recent threat that happened, like a bomb threat, and it happens all the time. Like it's so frequent now. Even one of our other author could not make it on the other launch day because same thing happened. So, but you were telling about this same thing in your chapter, which was very striking. That your community didn't react, accordingly. Like they were much more comfortable. They were like more prepared. So, what was already in place, that made that possible?
Well, Avi, to start off, just to introduce myself, I'm Bill Rooney, and I'm the superintendent of schools for the Dighton-Rehoboth Regional School District. We're in southeastern Massachusetts, nestled right in between Cape Cod and Providence, Rhode Island. It's a beautiful area. As a regional school district, I'm very fortunate to be a part of two outstanding towns, both Dighton and Rehoboth. Rehoboth is the birthplace of public education, so that's something that's really special about our district. And I just would also like to take the opportunity, my fellow panelists, and also I know a lot of people on the call are teachers or administrators, former teachers, and this is National Teacher Appreciation Week. So I just want to give a shout out to all the educators out there. What you do is such valuable work, and very grateful for it. And I'm in my 38th year, and just I'm blessed to have made the choice that I made several years ago. But my moment that you referred to, my bomb threat moment, actually occurred when I was a high school principal. So to kind of set the stage for everybody, we had brought about 1,000 of our students down to the auditorium for a very powerful motivational speaker, a gentleman by the name of, gentleman by the name of Chris Herron. He's a legend in the Massachusetts area as far as high school basketball. Played at Durfee High School in Fall River. Went on to sign a scholarship with Boston College, and was on a rocket ship in terms of basketball success. Chris made some bad decisions when he was at Boston College, transferred to Fresno State, where he got a chance to play for the legendary Jerry Tarkanian, and had some additional issues there, but was fortunate enough to land in the NBA. And, as a Celtics fan for my entire life, being able to listen to a former Celtic talk about his journey and how, if he had made different choices about drugs and alcohol, that his career would have been different. So I'm setting the stage for you that we have a very captivated audience listening to a very powerful speaker. And, as building administrators, we all had the walkie-talkies. And so all of a sudden you hear the light crackle of the walkie-talkie saying, "Principal Rooney, we need you on the third floor." That's never a good thing when they're calling the principal, because usually it's the dean of students or it's the assistant principal. And lo and behold, there was a bomb threat that was written on the bathroom wall. It had been reported by a student, and my superintendent happened to have her office in the same building. She met me there, and she was very supportive, but she said, "It's your building, and I want you to make the decision." What was already in place for us at that point, Avi, was a culture of trust. And trust isn't just built during a crisis. For the time that I had been there, we had worked really hard to regain a lot of public trust. And so long before that moment, there had already been consistent communication, visible leadership, not only from myself, but also from my team, but also strong relationships with our families in the community. And so people knew who we were, they knew how we operated, and they knew we would communicate honestly when something bad happened. In my chapter, I talk about the analogy of a bowling ball in a bathtub versus throwing a pebble into the ocean. And I think when you have that culture of trust and you have that culture of positivity, it builds depth. So when something negative happens, and something negative is always going to happen in schools. We've got young kids that are in our care, and they're going to make poor decisions. You're going to end up in the newspaper, or you're going to end up on the local TV station. But how it lands is what's really important in my chapter. And so if you've built that culture of trust and you've built that culture of positivity, the event still matters, and you want to make sure that you take ownership of that. But when you have the depth and the trust in your community, people still care, but they respond from a place of trust instead of fear or speculation. And I think that is what changes everything.
Wow, that's fantastic. I think that's a great story there, and we have much more stories in the book following this. So I think that's a very good starting point. And before we move on to the next section, where we'll talk about more from like decision that has gone wrong, so or almost gone wrong. I would love to pick up one question from the chat, and I love that. That's why I thought it's a good time that in today's world of social media outrage, um, how has the ambassador role changed, compared to 10, 15 years ago? Because social media can like blow things up out of proportion, and sometimes for good, sometimes for the bad. So how has the role evolved, in your opinion?
Well, I can kind of start off just to piggyback what I was mentioning as far as what my chapter, being able to communicate proactively and quickly is, whether it's a bomb threat issue or whether it's something very positive where, my district recently received a $1.5 million grant to advance our career and technical education programs. Because folks on Facebook, folks on social media are going to create their own narrative. And so it's something that it's really important for us to be able to get ahead of the narrative.
Makes sense.
Hey, I'll jump in because I'm such a fan of social media. Prior to social media, there typically, when things happen at a school, there typically were two stories: the real story that happened at school and the story that just went out into the community. Now, every single person has their own version of that story, and they take other stories to morph it into something that's totally different. So by the time you get to some type of conclusion, whatever took place online is not even close to what happened in school. So you have to play a game where you make sure you communicate specifically what happened, that you can then go back to when that crazy narrative goes out there. You can say, that's not what happened. We told you from the beginning, this was it. And you've got to make everybody aware of that in terms of over communicating and giving heads up to board members and mayors and community members that are important to help carry that narrative forward. That's something we never had to worry about before then, or at least I wasn't a superintendent that long ago. But those weren't things that were an issue then. A simple altercation at school was just two kids who got into an altercation. Now that same incident online becomes 40 kids having a mass gang fight in the cafeteria, and none of that's typically steeped in reality. So there's a balance that has to take place in an over communication that didn't exist before.
Absolutely. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say to piggyback on both of those comments, then the flip side of it is leveraging the power of social media because, one, our current generation of parents have grown up with social media, and that's how they prefer to consume information, and it's how their brains have been trained to consume information in these very short sound bites. Like Bill and Melvin both said, they want to know the information before it happens. They want to know it ahead of time. If not, they will put something out there that replaces it with an alternate reality. But the flip side of it is we know our schools and our classrooms are full of amazing people doing amazing things. They're happy, vibrant, warm places. Social media allows parents to see inside the classroom like they never have been able to before. A parent can't go in and see that their kid is doing well. They can hear about it. They can talk to their kid. Their kid could say at the dinner table, I like my teacher, or I don't, or they're a good teacher, or they're not. But we have the power with social media to show those little glimpses of what does an average day in one of our classrooms look like. And that's something very powerful for parents. I know as a parent myself, if I see my kid smiling, beaming, and happy and thriving in a social media post by the school district, I feel happy because I know they're happy. And I think, for school leaders and school district leaders, I would say that is an amazing question, something we need to tap into and continue to tap into if we want to show people what our actual experiences are like.
No, absolutely.
The only thing I would add to that, if I might, is just and using the similar metaphor concept again of the conductor is creating an allyship. In the medical world, they have what's called being a corporator, and if you're a corporator, you're like the evangelist of the organization. Apple, for example, has evangelists that work in their organization. Right, these are people who are in the inside, who have information and who have access to people outside of it. Because if it falls to one person, any one of us, you're not going to necessarily hit the mark and in the right time and in the right order. But if you can build this sort of roster of people that you trust, that also trust you to say, I'm working on a more detailed message, but in your message spaces, whether it's on Instagram or TikTok, wherever or Facebook, wherever people are that actually have voice, or various PTO groups or PTA groups that actually have a following and their own sort of, captive audience, use those networks to your advantage. And so that's something that's more of a strategic approach, depending on the nature of what's being communicated. But I often leverage those resources as well as a communication strategy.
No, perfect. Thank you so much for this question from the audience, and fantastic answers. So now round two, it's going to be an open question. So feel free to jump in and, share your opinions. But each one of you has been into a moment where doing the educationally right thing was also politically expensive. So walk us through those moments. What was the pressure look like? What did you do? And what would you do differently today in the hindsight?
I'll lead off if it's all right with my colleagues here. My first year as superintendent, I was on a 1-year contract, and I made the decision to not renew a principal who had been in the district for a long time. And I knew I was cashing in all of my political capital at that point, but I did it. I stood by my convictions because I believed it was the right thing to do for students. And when I centered my decision there, I could look myself in the mirror and know that I did the right thing. It was the hardest move of my career, and it could have actually ended my career right out of the gate, and it didn't. I've been a superintendent now for 19 years, and looking back, I wouldn't have changed a thing. I did the right thing. I centered it on what's best for kids, and that's been a really anchoring move for me ever since.
Absolutely love that. Anybody else has a comment on that?
Yeah, I'll add into that because Bob, you said something that resonates very deeply with me. You have to be kid first. You have to do right by kids. That is ultimately the mission of any school district. And it's easy to say that, and it's usually easy to do that. But there are times like what Bob just described. I went through something very similar. My first superintendency, again, I was a baby. I was 36, and there was a very popular staff member there who seemed to be doing amazing work. But the deeper I dug into it, I saw a lot of issues, a lot of things that were unethical, a lot of things that were unproductive. And I had to stick to my gumptions. And like Bob said, I had to say, if this isn't good for kids, if it's not good for the organization, I am the agent of the board's liability. If I put the Board of Ed in a position of liability, I have failed to do my job. And I had to make a tough call. It was extremely unpopular. And like Bob said, you do worry about, and I talked to my dear friend and colleague, Rob Preston, about this quite a bit. We do often skate by the skin of our teeth, and we realize how close we come to flying too close to the sun and having our wings melt like Icarus. But when it's the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do. And, we're often asked, I'm sure all my colleagues are as well, like, how do we sleep at night making all these decisions? If it's good for kids, whether I get fired or not is immaterial. I can put my head on the pillow at night knowing I did right by children.
Lovely.
Yeah, as far as from my perspective, a mistake that I made was just trying to communicate too quickly, even though I felt like I thought through my presentations really well or my communications really well. In Massachusetts, we refer to them as school committees rather than school boards, but, not giving them enough time to digest something. So we have a cadence of meeting every 2 weeks. And I can remember back towards the end of my second year, we were in pretty dire financial straits, and I had the opportunity to rent some space at our high school because of declining enrollment, at least at that time, to a special education collaborative that we had a partnership with. And it was a win-win. The collaborative needed to find a space because the space they had been using before was no longer available to them. And we were also going to reap financial benefits from it. Not to mention, the opportunity to really create even more of an inclusive environment by having additional students with special needs in our building. So I showed up at a school committee meeting with an elaborate presentation. They had received the packet a few days before, but it didn't land well. And that was because, they had a lot of questions, and it was just something that, that when I did it over again a year later, I gave them a preliminary presentation 2 weeks before the actual vote. And in the second go around, we got it right. So, as clear and as thoughtful as we can be sometimes with our communications, especially with our elected officials, being able to give them ample time to digest it, think of questions, ask those questions in advance, increases our chance of success.
Wow. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, my perspective, I was going into, it was the summer after my first year of superintendency in Montgomery, and we identified leadership issues at numbers of our buildings that needed to be confronted. So we took about the process of replacing 18 of our 54 principals after that first year. And I had to do a ton of communicating with our board to make sure they understood the who's and the why's and what was going to happen afterwards, what the leadership plans and succession plans looked like. And it ended up I think it worked out pretty well. We had academic gains after that change in the following year at every one of those schools except one. In addition to that, what I learned in that process is the importance of over communicating sometimes. Because when people will say you've done X, Y, and Z, and you haven't really done those things, you can go back to your communication and make sure you can document what's taking place and provide summaries of that information. They were tough decisions to make, and they're human decisions, but ultimately it is about kids. And if we're not willing to be fired from these roles for the sake of kids, then we don't deserve to have them. I firmly believe that.
Wow. I think that's one of the reasons that you guys are where you guys are, because keeping others' interest, or in this case, students' interest first, is the most important part, but it's also the hardest part in a journey. These are some fantastic questions coming in from the audience, which I want to pick up first and go away from our flow. So, what are the early signs that a school culture is becoming politically fragile? Before a crisis actually happen. With so much experience you guys can now be like a predictive engine about it. So, what do you guys think? What are the early signs? Anybody? Yeah.
I'll jump in and say, honestly, it depends on what your relationship actually is with your staff and with your leaders. Because if you don't have a strong culture and you haven't forged authentic, meaningful relationships and encouraged two-way candor, you won't see the early warning signs. It will be too late. And that's what really separates effective leaders from weak leaders. If you have built a silo around yourself where everybody tells you yes and everything's a great idea because you're, quote, the boss, you won't have early warning signs. People will just begin leaving their jobs, and by then it will be too late. People don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad leaders. So I would argue that the earliest warning signs hopefully would be people coming to you in confidence and speaking truth to power and making sure that you're able to get ahead of these. But I would caution most leaders to be very wary of that you might not see the early warning signs. There is always the separation of the superintendency from the rank and file.
Yeah. And, in Massachusetts, teachers unions, paraprofessional unions are a really important part of what our district leaders have to navigate. And so I meet biweekly with my teachers union leadership, and they are very candid with me about some of the things that are being discussed in the teachers' lounges, or some of the things that maybe aren't necessarily being expressed at a faculty meeting. And, I would encourage district leaders that have to work with unions to meet frequently with union leadership, be vulnerable with them in terms of gaining their trust and being able to confide in them. I've been able to really establish a nice relationship with the leadership of our teachers union. And I've been able to trust them with some information that they've been able to kind of deftly package to their members in terms of just wait, take a deep breath. Better things are, on the horizon, but we can't necessarily, lift the curtain completely on what the big picture is.
Yeah, I'll echo that. The relationship and partnership with the unions are important. So they can give you early warning signs. They can provide perspective on things that are going to be implemented. I've always found it interesting that we do all this recruiting and training for teachers, and then we bring them into the district. They join the union, and then suddenly they're the enemy. That makes no sense to me. You have to be partners in the work to make this happen. And yes, there'll be disagreements where you need to find common ground, but that's part of the journey in terms of building a strong culture. I would say, in addition to that, despite my disdain for social media, there are signs that can show up there as well that you can pick up on, where you can see fractures in your organization and respond to them appropriately. I'm not saying respond to every single thing you see online, but if there's a predominant story out there that you keep seeing over and over again, or that your team sees, that's something you're going to need to address in one way, shape, or form. So that can also be a mechanism of early warning.
No, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. And building on top of that, Al, when I was reading the chapter, you suggested that there has to be a one-on-one conversation with each board member, instead of treating them as a single audience. Though it sounds genuine and real, but how actually it is applicable on ground? What does that conversation look like, and how do you manage it?
Yeah, I'm sure we've all heard at some point somebody asks, "What does a superintendent do all day?" So they just walk around, smile, and drink coffee. I don't, So yeah, it's funny. There it is, Bill. It's funny, when I was a teacher, my very first superintendent was a former mayor. He wore very expensive suits. He had immense political power. He was like a superhero to me. And I once asked him, I said, "Hey, how do you make sure that you have enough votes to pass the items that are on your agenda?" And he kind of like put a fatherly wing around me and said, "Son, I know every vote before I go into that board meeting. You can guarantee it." And at the time, I think I was maybe 27 or 28 at the time. I remember going home and telling my wife, like, "Man, that's crazy. Like, I can't imagine having the acumen to do that, the power and the abilities." And now I get it. I'm starting. I'll be honest. I'm not perfect at this, but far from perfect at this. But I'm getting a better hold of what items on an agenda I truly think are going to be controversial, generate a number of questions. And there are times where that surprises me, and people ask questions, and I'm thinking, this is a slam dunk. I don't need to explain this. And then there are other times where I feel like I'm explaining myself out to wazoo, and then no one has any questions and no one cares. But I will say, when I identify something, or someone from my cabinet does and says, "Hey, this is probably something you want to get ahead of," I will call all 9 board members and I will speak with them, and I will say things like, "Hey, I wanted to bring this to your attention. I want you to be able to give some thought to this before you vote, and I want you to have an opportunity to speak with me and ask any questions that you have, because I can answer things much more abundantly and candidly in private than I can during the board's public session of their public meeting." And that's one of the things that I leverage. You want to ask a question about staff member issue, about, like Melvin saying, like when you're going to go in, or like Bob said, firing a popular principal, right? There are things you cannot and should not say in public. The employee has rights, and even beyond those rights, it's not ethical to talk about their performance in public. But individually, you can give a little bit of the context of why a decision was made. Same with any kind of expensive purchase, same with any kind of dramatic or potentially politically scandalous issue. New Jersey went through about 5 years ago new health standards that were controversial because of their sex ed content, or what was perceived to be their sex ed content. Those are items I like to get ahead of, speak to people one-on-one. And then eventually what happens is you build a level of trust, where I have some board members who all I have to say is, "This is what's on the agenda." And they say, "Hey, stop there. I got it. You're good. I'm going to vote yes. Thank you." Others, they ask a number of questions. That's their right as an elected official. They are there to represent their sphere of the community and to ensure that what comes through the school district mirrors the values and the perspectives of the communities that we serve. So it is time consuming, but it is time well spent, because if not, you are going to invest more time playing cleanup after the board meeting, and you are going to lose trust and you're going to lose political capital, neither of which a superintendent, especially early on in their career, can afford to waste.
That makes sense. I think it's like comparing short-term versus long-term investment. So you have to be smart about it. Melvin, you also named 4 qualities board respond to, clarity, humility, consistency, and humanity. So if a leader picks just one focus, for the next
Mhm.
90 days, where do you tell them to start out of these 4?
I would start with clarity, just based on my own experience. It's important that we all understand our roles and what they're supposed to look like and operationalize them so that we can be effective as leaders and efficient in the work. Far too often, sometimes we get out of our guardrails and we're venturing into areas that aren't really our responsibility or that we're not aware of or whatever the case may be. So I think it's important that there's that clarity that this is my role, this is your role, this is how we're going to execute them, this is how I'll communicate, and I'd like for you to communicate with me, and making sure those things are very transparent and upfront from the very beginning, so there are no surprises, there are no gotchas, things of that nature. Going back to what Al was talking about in reference to giving board members a heads up of what's going to be on the agenda. Sometimes they're going to ask you crazy questions that you're not prepared for, which then makes you look incompetent in many respects. So I appreciate getting those questions early, and it doesn't cause rifts and anger or frustration, what have you. And then sometimes they're going to ask those questions regardless. Those probably are the most frustrating moments when you don't know a question's coming. So the more you communicate, the more you can avoid those types of things. So I think clarity of purpose, clarity of roles, clarity of how we get the work done, probably the most important thing to establish up front. And if you do that up front, those other 3 pieces should be able to fall in line fairly quickly.
No, makes sense. Clarity is the focus for sure. Bob, you talked about aligning your why, your what, and your when. So can you give us an example, a real example of what that alignment looked like, in one of your initiatives?
Yeah, sure. I borrow from the political science literature when I did my dissertation around the politics of school leadership, and I think of it this way: is there's sort of 2 elements to this. There's this sort of punctuated equilibrium concept and this windows of opportunity idea. And so the opportunity is, when you see something, or if you're grounded in your why, and then often it's our strategic priorities, right? Our why is what we value, our mission statements, our core values. And when you stay centered there, it really helps with decision making, right? It goes back to our student-centric decision making, but also when we move in a direction that aligns to our district core values, it either aligns with it or it doesn't. So it makes decision making a little bit easier, not necessarily logistically easier, but philosophically easier to say, to a staff member, to a leader, your behavior, your work does not align with our core values. It becomes less personalized. When you think about the sort of political front, budgets, and what people are paying attention to, you really have to have that sort of savvy or that prowess to be looking at what is the community, what matters to the community. And if it doesn't matter to the community, or if they're not aware of it, then it's our job to educate the community and create the awareness. And so that is the window of opportunity. And that happens when you have, to the earlier points around, what does the superintendent do all day? Well, we may spend time talking, if in this realm, to city councilors, to the senior center, council on aging, and making sure I'm having conversations with grandparents about what are your hopes and dreams for your grandchild that they're going to learn in school, and then you begin to rally sort of unlikely allies who are in the community, but helping to move this agenda, this educational agenda forward. So is the fine line there, right, between getting buy-in, getting consensus, and being manipulative. And I'm not suggesting the latter, right? I'm not suggesting this is something you should go out and manipulate this. It's having this, and this has been said before about these authentic one-to-one conversations and understanding your community. So I think that is my lens of sort of aligning the why, the what, and the when. And it goes back to just being, but also knowing who the players are, and to the point that was made around, knowing the votes, knowing who's going to vote in which way. We had an opportunity. I'll show this one quick little snapshot. Around the pandemic time, we had a central office building, and we were paying $550,000 a year to lease this office space. The pandemic came, and nobody knew, and this lease was up for. They were considering whether to buy the building or not, and we didn't know when we'd be coming back to school, or if we were coming back to school. There's all the unknowns. And I made this decision with my team and said, hey, how about this idea? What if we just don't renew the lease, which at the time was a real challenge between the mayor and the city council. I said, what if we don't renew the lease? Everybody works from home, and then we find another school-based space instead of paying this expensive lease going forward. And lo and behold, it worked. It was a lot of people. There was a lot of upset that this created, having these beautiful sort of lavish offices, if you will. But then everyone worked from home for about a year or so, but doing so was a phone call with every city councilor, every member of the school committee ahead of time to make sure that those votes were lined up. So when this wild idea was pitched, it wasn't going to be met with this sort of feeling of embarrassment or feeling like you not know what you're doing. But it was a tremendous risk, right? So it's the windows of opportunity. It's being aware of the community. It's the one-to-one relationships. It's all the things we've talked about sort of rolled into one package. But it's mostly being aware, being accessible, and being visible in a community so people begin to trust you.
What makes sense? Absolutely. So last question to Bill. So your 1 year rule, that you mentioned, that you start telling a story a year before the vote, and it's a very tactical gem in my opinion. But what's the first story a leader should start telling, right now, if you have a major initiative coming up next spring?
Yeah, this one's a perfect one for me, Avi, because of the fact that in the spring of 2027, just 12 short months from now, we're going to have a vote in one of our communities about the possibility of renovating or rebuilding one of our elementary schools. And, I think the first thing that a leader has to identify is the why. Obviously, you can state facts about the building was built in 1953. It was renovated in 1993. But in taking it back to, what some of my esteemed colleagues have already talked about, the impact on the children, and not only that, but the staff members who are working with them. Too often, I think we have so many priorities as district leaders that sometimes we don't get an opportunity to really forecast out what's in the future. And if you've got something that's really big on the horizon, you cannot wait until it's a month or so before that vote. If you know that you have something significant, the work begins now in terms of building understanding, building trust, bring people into the process early. In our particular case, we've been having community engagement sessions. Tonight, as a matter of fact, our architect and our project manager are joining me at a parent-teacher organization meeting to be able to have just a different audience. We're going to eventually spend some time with the Council on Aging and various department heads. So I think it's really just important to identify the why, create a steady message, and repeat that message calmly and consistently over time, because surprise creates resistance. Preparation builds trust.
Love that. All the best for the vote. I hope you get it right. So I think that's the end of the session. There's so many great points, which motivates me further to go back to those chapter. And that's the whole idea, that this book is not a one-time read, or go to the entire start to finish in one sitting. It's more like a playbook. So you want to come back to it, and even you forget those ideas, those stories, it is a great reminder. So that's the whole idea of this book, and I'm so glad this is coming out in this way. So thank you so much. Is there any question that you want to pick up? I'll just check with Shreyas.
Avi, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. You're saying something.
Well, I saw one of the questions in the chat about, for anyone in the audience who's early in their leadership journey and the weight of the role, what would you say to them? I think that the analogy of a duck gliding across a placid lake is a wonderful image of what district and school leaders need to look like, because we're paddling like heck underneath. But it's really important that we show that confidence and that consistency, like the duck gliding across the lake.
Bill, I'm so glad you brought that up. That actually used to hang on my in-laws' fridge when I was dating my wife, and my mother-in-law had a magnet of it, and she said that was her goal, be like a duck. But I agree, you can't underestimate that being the calm in somebody's day, right? Because just as you eloquently said, Surprises create stress and anxiety. They create resistance. We know that. We know change theory. People in general are resistant to change, and that's okay, but change is coming anyway. So when you are that calm factor in the school day, you calmly and consistently show up, that is invaluable to the organization. So as an earlier in your journey leader, if those are the folks that are in this audience right now, that's the service that you bring. That's part of your leadership identity. It's part of what makes you the leader, is that without you there, in the absence of that calm, in the absence of you shouldering that load, the organization weakens and you create a tender spot in it. And all of that stress doesn't go away. It gets distributed out across the organization. So your assistant superintendents will feel it if you don't, right? And I liken it to, being a father. If I'm not the calm in my family's day, I failed as a father, because that's part of my role, is to bring that steady and stability. So that is something you will grow as a skill. That's the good news. The bad news is you will deal with that throughout your leadership journey, but you will get better at it year after year, because you will go through the experiences and you'll learn to shoulder that with more grace and more calm.
I can completely echo all of that. Only thing I want to add is also, when you're feeling those stressors that drive you nuts as a leader, as a superintendent, and you maintain that calm demeanor and no one knows, that's what it's supposed to look like. I've always said I'm supposed to take that on so that my cabinet, my senior staff, my principals can go about doing their daily work without having those stressors. It's my job to carry all that for them. When things happen and they discover something like, I didn't know you were dealing with that. Like, yeah, I've been dealing with that by 8 months, but that's my job to carry that. And it's important to understand that weight and be willing to carry it so that your district can function in the way it's supposed to without chaos.
There's two staple items in my office. One, boxes of Kleenex and a plastic trash can, because people can come in my office, they can shut the door, and whether they need to cry or whether they need to punt the trash can, that's the safe space. But again, as Melvin and Al both said, being that rock for people, being that source of consistency is so extremely important, especially these days.
Absolutely. Can't agree more on that. But yeah, I would love to respect the time that I have taken up from you guys from a daily schedule. So thank you so much. There are so many messages that I would be responding personally on YouTube Live in the comments or in the LinkedIn Live. So thank you so much, guys. Keep on passing on those questions and we'll try to get back to them as soon as possible. But you can download the book and get to know more about each of the authors, their journey and their strategies from our website. It's available for free. It's paid on Amazon for now. They're not letting me put it for free now anymore, but it's on our website for free. And you can also join the Slack community to get to know more about us and behind the scenes. But thank you so much. And there's a next book tour on May 14, same time. So we'll send you the invites for that as well. But thank you so much, Al, Melvin, Bill, and Bob, for doing this, for being so consistently going out and communicating about your books to everyone. I am having a ball and it's exciting. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
It's an
everybody.
honor to be here.
Thanks, everyone, for participating.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Have a good day, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.